The rain had been falling all night in Atlanta, and the streets were slick with water and broken dreams. Jasmine stood outside the glass building, clutching her little boy's hand. His name was Malik, and he was 6 years old, with big brown eyes that shone even in the dark. Jasmine's fingers were numb, not just from the cold, but from the fear sitting heavy in her chest. She looked up at the tall glass tower where the tech giant had its office and whispered to herself, "He has to help me. There's no one else left." Inside that building, Sundar Pichai was sitting quietly in a conference room, far away from home and even farther away from peace. His team was talking numbers, charts, and projections, but Sundar's mind kept drifting. He thought about his own mother back in India and how she used to say, "If someone comes to your door with tears in their eyes, you do not send them away." Those words always stayed with him. Outside, Jasmine tightened Malik's coat around him. She had written a letter, but when she tried to give it to the receptionist earlier, the woman barely looked at her and said Mr. Pichai was far too busy. She had begged then, quietly at first, and then louder, but the security guard had walked over and told her to leave. But Jasmine knew something that they didn't. She knew desperation could break through any locked door. She waited until the last light on the 10th floor switched off. Then she pressed her hand against the glass and whispered to Malik, "Stay right here, baby. If I can just talk to him just for 1 minute, everything will change." Malik nodded, though he didn't understand. His little face was pale from the cold, but he trusted her. Meanwhile, upstairs, Sundar stood to leave. He was tired, but as he walked toward the elevator, something caught his eye. Outside the big glass windows at the edge of the parking lot, he saw a woman with a small child standing in the rain. They weren't moving. They weren't hiding. They were just waiting. His steps slowed as the elevator doors opened. He hesitated. Then something inside him, maybe his mother's voice, told him to walk toward the window instead. The closer he looked, the clearer he could see her face. And it was not just sadness there, but a kind of quiet determination that startled him. On the ground, Jasmine saw a movement. Someone had stopped at the window. Her heart began to race. She waved both arms, the letter flapping from her fingers, and she shouted, "Please, please, just 1 minute." The security guard noticed and started walking toward her again. But this time, Sundar raised a hand from above. "Let her in," he said, so softly that even he didn't recognize his own voice. 10 minutes later, Jasmine and Malik were sitting in a warm office. Her clothes were wet and Malik's shoes squeaked against the marble floor. Sundar sat across from her, his eyes kind but serious. "Why are you here?" he asked gently. At first, Jasmine couldn't speak. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, but now that it had come, her throat felt tight. Finally, she whispered, "I don't want money. I just need you to listen." Sundar nodded. "Then I will listen." And so she told him. She told him about growing up in a small southern town where no one believed she would ever amount to anything. About how she was the first in her family to graduate high school. About how she married too young to a man who promised her everything and gave her nothing. About how after he left, she worked 2 jobs just to keep Malik fed. And how when she finally saved enough to go to college at night, the school cut her financial aid because of a technical error she couldn't fix. "I emailed your company," she said, her voice breaking now. "Because it was your software they were using. The system glitched. I lost everything." No one replied. "I called. They hung up. So I came here." Sundar stayed quiet, but inside he felt a sharp pain. He looked at Malik, who was sitting on the floor now, playing with the hem of his mother's coat. The boy didn't look sad. He just looked tired. "What do you want me to do?" Sundar asked softly. Jasmine opened the crumpled letter and placed it in front of him. "I want you to see me," she said. "I want you to see my son. And I want you to care." He picked up the letter. His hands trembled just slightly as he read it. In the letter, she explained everything she just told him. But in her handwriting, it sounded even more raw. She wrote about nights when she went hungry so Malik could eat. She wrote about hiding in the bathroom at work because she didn't want her coworkers to see her cry. She wrote about how she believed, truly believed, that someone, somewhere, at the top would care enough to help her. Do you? She asked finally. Her voice was so quiet it was almost swallowed by the sound of the rain still beating against the windows. Sundar folded the letter neatly and put it on the table. Then he said, I see you. And in that moment, Jasmine started to cry. But just then, the office door burst open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, looking angry. Mr. Pichai, he began, you have a meeting with the board in 5 minutes. We don't have time for her, but he stopped when he saw Jasmine. And Malik, and the way Sundar was looking at them, cancel the meeting, Sundar said calmly. The man stared at him. Sir? I said. Sundar repeated. Cancel the meeting. The man left, muttering something under his breath when the door closed. Again, Sundar turned back to Jasmine. He smiled, though it was a sad sort of smile. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. And so she did. She told him about her first job at a fast food counter and how her manager used to yell at her in front of customers. About the night Malik was born and how she prayed he would have a better life than she did. About how, for years, she believed hard work would be enough, and about how the world seemed determined to prove her wrong. As she spoke, Sundar listened and listened and listened. And outside the office window, the rain began to stop. The clouds parted, just a little, and a thin slice of moonlight slipped through. When she finished, Sundar took a deep breath. You're right, he said. We failed you. I failed you. Jasmine shook her head. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't, he said. I feel ashamed, but not sorry. She frowned. What's the difference? He looked down at Malik, who was now asleep on the couch. Then back at her. Ashamed means I have to do something about it. And for the first time that night, Jasmine allowed herself to hope. But just as she opened her mouth to thank him, the office phone rang. Sundar glanced at it, annoyed. Then he saw the color drain from his assistant's face on the other end of the line. Sir, the assistant said, you need to come downstairs. Now. Sundar stood slowly. What happened? The assistant hesitated. There's someone here, he says. He says if you don't come outside in 5 minutes, people are going to get hurt. Jasmine froze. Her stomach twisted into a knot. Who? Sundar demanded. He won't give his name, the assistant whispered. But he says he knows about the woman and her son. Sundar's eyes narrowed. Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at Malik, sleeping peacefully, and then at Sundar. What does that mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Sundar didn't answer. Instead, he turned to her and said, stay here. Whatever happens, don't open that door. But she grabbed his sleeve before he could leave. Please, she begged. Don't go out there alone. He looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Not fear. Not pride, but resolve. I'll be right back, he said. And then he was gone. Jasmine held Malik close as the minutes stretched on like hours. Somewhere far below, she heard shouting, then silence. Then the sound of footsteps approaching, but it wasn't Sundar who came through the door. It was someone else entirely. Someone who knew her name. And as he stepped into the room, Jasmine's heart stopped. Jasmine's fingers tightened around Malik's little jacket as the door swung open. The sound of it, sharp and sudden, made her flinch. Her heart was already pounding so hard she thought the man standing there could probably hear it. He stepped inside slowly, shutting the door behind him, and for a moment the room felt darker. Even though the lights hadn't changed, he was tall and broad, dressed in a long black coat that was still dripping rainwater onto the polished floor. His eyes scanned the room and stopped right on her, and a thin smile touched his lips. He moved closer, and Jasmine instinctively pulled Malik closer to her chest. Though the boy was still asleep, his cheek resting against her shoulder. The man didn't speak right away, and the silence between them grew heavy, filling every corner of the room. Jasmine felt a bead of sweat trickle down her back despite the chill. Finally, he stopped a few feet from her and tilted his head, slightly, as though amused by what he saw. A tired woman clinging to her child like a shield. You didn't think this would end quietly, did you? His voice was smooth but cold, like someone who enjoyed watching people squirm. He glanced around the office. Then, at the door Sundar had disappeared through moments before. He shouldn't have left you alone, he added softly, almost like a whisper meant just for her. Jasmine swallowed hard, her mouth dry, and tried to steady her breathing. Who are you? She managed to say, though her voice cracked. The man chuckled, a low sound that sent a shiver up her spine. He took another step closer and leaned down slightly, so his face was level with hers. Someone who knows what you're really doing here, he said. His eyes flicked to Malik, then back to her. And someone who knows the truth you didn't put in your letter. For a second, Jasmine's body froze, her mind racing through all the things she hadn't written down, the private thoughts, the nights she didn't tell anyone about, the choices she regretted but never confessed. Her hands trembled against Malik's back as she whispered, "You don't know anything about me." But he only smiled again and straightened up. "Oh, but I do," he murmured. "More than he does." Just then, the sound of voices outside the office grew louder. She heard Sundar's calm but firm tone cutting through the confusion, and the man's expression hardened. He glanced toward the door, then back at Jasmine. "Don't make the mistake of thinking he can save you," he said quietly, his words like ice. "Some things can't be fixed by kindness." Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Sundar appeared, flanked by 2 security guards who stopped short when they saw the man standing so close to her. Sundar's eyes narrowed instantly, and he stepped forward, placing himself between Jasmine and the stranger. "Leave," Sundar said, his voice sharper than Jasmine had heard it all night. "You don't belong here." But the man didn't move. He just stared at Sundar with a strange mixture of contempt and amusement. "You think you're doing her a favor?" he said softly. "But you have no idea what you're inviting into. Your life." The 2 security guards moved toward him then, and finally he straightened his coat, gave one last look at Jasmine, and walked out without another word. When the door clicked shut behind him, the tension in the room seemed to ease. Just slightly. Sundar turned to Jasmine, his expression still guarded, but gentler now. "Are you all right?" he asked. Jasmine nodded weakly, though she wasn't sure she meant it. Her hands were still shaking as she clung to Malik, who stirred a little in his sleep, but didn't wake up. Sundar crouched down in front of her so their eyes were level. "I need you to trust me," he said softly. "Whatever that man said, whatever he thinks he knows, you are safe here, with me." His words were calm, but Jasmine could see something flicker behind his eyes, something like doubt. He stood and gestured to one of the guards. "Please escort them to a quieter room," he said. "Someplace comfortable." The guard nodded and led her and Malik down a long hallway to a smaller office with a couch and soft lighting. As soon as they were alone, Jasmine sat down and laid Malik across her lap, brushing his curls back from his forehead. Her mind was still reeling from what had just happened. Who was that man? How did he know her name? And why did it feel like he knew something she didn't even know about herself? She closed her eyes and let her head fall back against the couch, but rest didn't come. Her thoughts kept circling, one after another, louder and faster. She thought back to earlier that week when she had found a plain white envelope slid under her apartment door. There had been no return address, no explanation, just a note inside that said, "You won't find the answers here. Go to him." Telling the truth, at the time she assumed it was just some cruel joke, but now she wondered, had that man sent it? And if he had, why? Her thoughts were interrupted when the door opened again and Sundar stepped inside. He looked tired but composed, his tie slightly loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He carried 2 cups of tea and handed one to her. "You look like you need this," he said gently. She accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you," and tried to take a sip, though her hand still trembled. Sundar sat on the edge of the couch opposite her and watched her for a moment before speaking again. "He's gone," he said, and I've asked security to keep an eye on the building for the rest of the night. But I need you to tell me, is there something you haven't told me yet? Jasmine felt her stomach twist at his words. She opened her mouth to say no, to insist that she had told him everything. But then she saw the way he was looking at her, not angry, not accusing, but quietly waiting. And somehow that made it harder to lie. She took a deep breath and lowered her gaze. There's something, she admitted finally. But I didn't think it mattered. I thought it was just my past, and I thought I could leave it behind. Sundar nodded, encouraging her without pushing. She stared into her tea for a long moment before whispering. When Malik's father left, he didn't just leave. He left because of a debt, and not the kind you can just pay with money. She stopped there, her voice cracking, and Sundar leaned forward slightly. What kind of debt? He asked quietly. Jasmine shook her head. I don't know, she said. He never told me. But people came looking for him after he'd disappeared. They came to my apartment. They waited outside Malik's school. And then, one day, they just stopped. She finally looked up at him, then her eyes shining with unshed tears. But now they're back, she whispered. Aren't they? Sundar didn't answer right away. He just reached across the small table and rested his hand over hers. His touch was warm, grounding her just enough to keep her from unraveling. Completely. We'll figure it out, he said softly. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out. But even as he said the words, his own mind was already spinning. He thought about the man in the black coat, about the way he spoke, about the strange confidence in his voice. It was more than just a threat. It was a warning. Just then, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. And then the room went dark. Jasmine gasped and instinctively clutched Malik tighter. Sundar stood immediately, his expression tense but controlled. Stay here, he said firmly. But before he could even reach the door, it opened slowly, and the silhouette of the man in the black coat stood there once again. This time, he didn't smile. This time, he didn't say anything at all. He just held up a single photograph and let it fall to the floor. Jasmine stared at it, her blood running cold as it landed face up by her feet. It was a picture of her holding Malik standing in front of her apartment building. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, was the shadow of someone watching them, someone she hadn't even known was there when she looked up. The man was gone again, leaving only the faint echo of his footsteps behind. Jasmine's hands shook as she reached down and picked up the photo. Sundar crouched beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something she hadn't seen before, not fear. But he took the photo from her gently, studied it for a moment, then looked at her. We need to talk, he said, and away. He said it sent chills through her because, for the first time all night, Jasmine realized Sundar Pichai was no longer just listening. He was planning. And she had no idea what he was planning to do. The room was still dark except for the faint emergency light glowing above the door, casting everything in strange shades of gray. Jasmine sat frozen on the couch, clutching Malik so tightly now that she could feel the steady beat of his small heart against her chest. He stirred faintly in his sleep, but didn't wake, his little fingers curling around the fabric of her sleeve. Her eyes stayed fixed on Sundar, who was crouched by her side, still holding the photograph between his fingers. He hadn't said a word since he picked it up, but there was something different about him now, something sharper, colder, as if the kind man who had listened to her story earlier had been replaced by someone else entirely. The silence was thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the building's backup generators kicking in somewhere far below. Sundar turned the photograph over, his thumb tracing the edges of the glossy paper, and then he stood slowly, slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket. His gaze moved to Jasmine, and in the dim light his eyes looked almost black. They've been watching you longer than you realize, he said quietly, and his voice, though calm, sent a chill through her. Jasmine, single quotes, breath caught in her throat. Who? She asked, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. Sundar didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. Rain still fell lightly, streaking the glass and blurring the bright lights of Atlanta into smudges of gold and red. He stood there for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, and when he finally spoke, his words were low and deliberate. There are people, he began, who make it their business to stay invisible. People who hide in shadows and control things you and I will never see. Most of the time, they're content to keep to themselves, as long as no one threatens their interests. But every now and then, someone stumbles too close, and then they send someone to remind you who really holds the power. He turned back to her then, his expression unreadable. That man you saw that night, he's not just a messenger. He's a warning. Jasmine felt her stomach twist at his words. She hugged Malik closer, as though she could shield him from all of it just by holding him tightly enough. But why me? She asked, her voice cracking. I'm nobody. I just wanted to help. Sundar's jaw tightened, and for the briefest moment she saw something in his face. Guilt. He lowered his eyes. Because, he said softly, you walked through the wrong door. And you spoke to the wrong man. Jasmine stared at him, her chest rising and falling in short, shallow breaths. She wanted to scream at him, to demand that he explain, to tell him this wasn't fair, but all she could do was whisper, then why did you open the door? He held her gaze, and this time, his answer came without hesitation. Because, he said, someone has to. For a long moment they just sat there, the weight of his words hanging between them. Then Sundar straightened, his whole posture shifting into something harder, more decisive. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim phone, pressing it. To his ear, it's me, he said quietly when someone picked up on the other end. I need a car at the back entrance, now, and clear the parking garage. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he reached out a hand to Jasmine. Come with me, he said simply. She stared at his hand, at the clean lines of his suit sleeve, at the quiet strength in the way he stood there, and something inside her told her there was no turning back now. She took his hand and he pulled her gently to her feet. Careful not to wake Malik Dot, they moved quickly and quietly through the darkened hallway, their footsteps echoing off the marble floor. Every corner they passed felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. When they reached a heavy metal door at the far end of the corridor, Sundar paused and pressed his ear to it for a moment before pushing it open. The air outside was damp and sharp, and the parking garage was nearly empty. A black car waited at the far end, its engine already running, headlights cutting two clean lines through the darkness. Sundar led Jasmine toward it, his hand steady on her back. But as they approached, Jasmine noticed something. A shadow near. One of the concrete pillars just barely visible in the dim light. She stopped short, her instincts screaming at her. Wait, she whispered. Urgently, Sundar froze, following her gaze. For a second, everything was still, and then the shadow moved. A figure stepped out from behind the pillar, slow and deliberate, and Jasmine's stomach dropped when she recognized him. It was the man in the black coat. His smile this time was different, tighter, more dangerous. He stood there blocking their path, his hands clasped loosely in front of him as though he had all the time in the world, going somewhere. He asked softly, his voice carrying across the concrete. Sundar stepped forward, positioning himself between Jasmine and the man, his shoulders squared. Get out of our way, he said evenly. But the man only chuckled, a dry sound that echoed. Off the walls. You still don't understand, he murmured. This isn't about you. It was never about you. Sundar's jaw tightened. Then who? The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking past Sundar to where Jasmine stood. Clutching Malik. You're asking the wrong questions, he said. It's not who. It's what she knows. Jasmine's breath caught, and for a moment the air seemed to thicken around her. I don't know anything, she said, though her voice wavered even as she said it, but the man just smiled faintly, as though he pitied her. You will, he said before Sundar could respond. The sound of tires squealing cut through the tension. A second black car appeared from around the corner of the garage, its lights blinding for a moment. Sundar grabbed Jasmine's arm, pulled her toward the waiting car, barking something at the driver, who immediately threw open the rear door. "Get in." Sundar ordered. Jasmine scrambled into the back seat, clutching Malik to her chest, and Sundar slid in after her, just as the car lurched forward. She turned to look out the back window and saw the man in the black coat still standing there, watching them go, his figure growing smaller and smaller, but never moving. They drove in silence for several minutes, the city lights flashing past, outside the tinted windows. Jasmine stared down at Malik, her fingers brushing through his curls, and tried to calm the storm inside her chest. Finally, she looked up at Sundar, who was staring out the opposite window, his brow furrowed. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. He didn't look at her when he answered. "Someplace they can't follow," he said. She didn't press him further. She just sank back into the seat, feeling the warmth of Malik against her and the weight of everything that had just happened settling on her shoulders. But even as fear coiled tighter inside her, there was something else too, something strange and fragile but unmistakable. Hope. 20 minutes later, the car pulled into a narrow alley behind an unmarked building. Sundar opened his door and stepped out, then held his hand out to help Jasmine down. They slipped through a side entrance and into a quiet stairwell, climbing 3 flights before reaching a heavy door. Sundar pulled out a key and unlocked it, revealing a small but warm room, softly lit and filled with the faint smell of coffee and books. "You'll be safe here," he said, closing the door behind them. Jasmine sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding Malik, who stirred now and opened his eyes sleepily. She kissed his forehead and murmured, "Go back to sleep, baby." And he nodded drowsily before curling up against her. Sundar stood by the window, looking out at the street below, his hands in his pockets. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "There's something you're not telling me," he said. Jasmine looked up at him, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. He turned then, and in the dim light his expression was softer than it had been in the garage, but no less intense. He walked over and crouched in front of her, resting his hands on his knees. So their faces were level. "That man wasn't just here to scare you," Sundar said. "He was here because of something only you can give him, something you don't even know you have." Jasmine shook her head, confused and overwhelmed. "What could I possibly have?" she whispered. Sundar studied her for a long moment before answering. "Answers," he said. "You have answers?" Jasmine stared at him, her mind spinning, but before she could speak, there was a sharp knock at the door, 3 quick raps that made her jump. Sundar rose to his feet instantly, his entire body going still. He motioned for her to stay quiet as he moved toward the door, pressing his ear to it. Another knock. Then a voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Let me in," it said. Before it's too late, Jasmine's blood ran cold as she recognized the voice. It wasn't the man in the black coat. It was Malik's father. Asterisk for a long moment. The only sound in the little room was Jasmine's own heartbeat thudding in her ears. Her breath came shallow and fast as she clutched Malik closer, feeling his tiny fingers curl into her shirt in his sleep. She stared at the door where Sundar stood motionless, his head slightly bowed, as though he were listening to more. Then just the knock, as though he were weighing every possibility at once. The voice came again, firmer this time, but quieter. Too, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. "Jasmine, open the door. It's me. You know it's me." Her stomach twisted so sharply she thought she might be sick. She hadn't heard that voice in years, not since the night he disappeared. She thought she'd forgotten the way it curled around her name, how it could be so gentle and so sharp at once. But hearing it now, muffled through a stranger's door in the middle of a rain-slicked city, she felt it all come back. The nights waiting for him to come home. The lies, the shouting. Quiet dread she learned to live with. Sundar glanced at her then, his eyes dark but steady, and she shook her head quickly, almost frantically. "Don't," she mouthed, her voice barely audible. "Don't open it." But whoever stood on the other side must have heard the movement, because The next sound they heard was a slow, deliberate turning of the doorknob. Locked. Jasmine. The voice said again, this time laced with something harder, something like warning. I don't have time for you to be scared of me. Open the door before they find us both. Sundar straightened then, every inch of his posture calm but tense, like a wire pulled taut. He moved closer to the door, his hand resting on the knob, though he didn't turn it yet. Who are you? He called out quietly, his voice calm, measured. There was silence for a moment on the other side, and then a bitter laugh. You know who I am? The voice replied. You know why I'm here? And if you don't, then you're even more naive than they say you are. Jasmine felt something in her chest tighten at those words, and she rose slowly from the bed, still holding Malik, but unwilling to stay seated while that voice slithered under the doorframe. Why now? She said aloud, her voice cracking as she stepped forward, past Sundar's shoulder. Why after all these years? There was a pause, and then, so soft she barely heard it, because you're the only one left. That sentence hung in the air like a blade. Sundar and Jasmine exchanged a glance, and he gestured silently for her to step back. She obeyed, though every nerve in her body screamed at her to run. Sundar unlocked the door, but didn't open it fully. Instead, he cracked it just enough to see who was on the other side. The man standing there was taller than she remembered. His shoulders broader, his hair shorter and streaked with gray now. His face bore the marks of years she hadn't been allowed to see, deep lines around his mouth, a faint scar under one eye, but the eyes themselves were the same, dark and restless and full of something she couldn't name. You shouldn't be here, Sundar said, his voice low and even. The man smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. You don't get to tell me that, he replied. She does. And she hasn't yet? His gaze shifted past Sundar to where Jasmine stood in the dim light, her arms wrapped tightly around Malik. For a moment, his face softened, just slightly. As he looked at the boy, he's gotten big, he said quietly. Jasmine said nothing. Her throat felt too tight to form words. Sundar blocked the doorway, his frame just enough to keep the man from stepping inside. What do you want? Sundar asked. The man's jaw tightened. I want to fix what I broke, he said. Jasmine felt her knees go weak at that. She almost laughed, though it came out closer to a sob. You can't, she said hoarsely. You can't just show up now and say that. You don't get to fix anything. He flinched that, but didn't look away. You don't understand, he said. They told me if I stayed away, you'd be safe. They promised. And I believed them, but now they're after you. Anyway, and that's on me, so I'm here to make it right. Sundar's expression didn't change, but his hand gripped the edge of the door just a little tighter. And how do you plan to do that? The man's eyes hardened. By ending it, he said simply. Jasmine stared at him, her heart hammering. Ending what? She demanded. He finally looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Real, raw fear. The deal, he said. The one I made? The one that put you in their sights? And just like that, the pieces started clicking into place. She remembered late nights when he would disappear without explanation. The strange calls he'd take in the other room, the envelopes of cash he'd hide in their closet. She remembered the way he'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering things she didn't understand. And now, finally, she realized she'd never even known half of it. You sold us, she whispered. You sold us to them. He didn't deny it. Sundar finally spoke then, his voice quiet but edged with steel. You've said enough, he said. If you really want to protect her, you'll leave now and let me handle it. But the man shook his head. You can't handle them, he said. You don't even know who you're dealing with. But I do, and I'm the only one who can stop this. Before Sundar could reply, the sound of a car pulling up outside cut through the room. All three of them froze, listening. The man's face went pale. They're here, he murmured. Sundar shut the door and locked it, his movements quick and precise. He turned to Jasmine and took her hand firmly. Take Malik, he said. Go to the bedroom. Don't come out unless I come for you. Jasmine nodded numbly, clutching Malik tighter and backing away toward the small bedroom at the back of the suite. She paused in the doorway and looked back at Sundar and the man, two men who couldn't have been more different, and yet both standing now between her and something she couldn't even name. The knock came then, slow, deliberate like before. Sundar's jaw tightened, and he moved to stand in front of the door. The man stepped up beside him, his eyes fixed on the handle. "Don't open it," the man whispered. But Sundar didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, and then a voice. Low, smooth, terrifyingly calm. "You've had your fun," it said. "But now it's time to pay what's owed." Jasmine pressed a trembling hand over Malik's ear and held her breath as she watched from the shadows of the bedroom doorway. Sundar glanced at the man beside him, then at the door. "How many?" he asked quietly. The man closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Too many," he said. Another knock. This time the voice came with it, sharper now. "You have 5 seconds to open this door, Mr. Pichai. After that, we stop asking." Sundar's jaw tightened, and he took a slow breath. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something Jasmine couldn't quite see. Something small and black that glinted faintly in the dim light. "Stay here," he murmured to the man, and before either of them could stop him, Sundar unlocked the door and swung it open. The hallway outside was empty, at least at first glance. Then, from the shadows, 2 figures stepped forward. Both were dressed in black, their faces hidden, moving with quiet precision. They stopped a few feet from the door, their hands clasped loosely in front of them. One of them tilted his head slightly. "You've made this much more complicated than it needed to be," he said. Sundar's hand tightened on whatever he held in his pocket. "And you've made a mistake," he replied quietly. The figure laughed softly, not kindly. "You think you can win this?" He asked but Sundar only smiled faintly, a smile Jasmine had never seen before, calm and dangerous all at once. "Don't have to win," he said. "I just have to end it." And with that, he stepped forward. There was a sudden blur of motion, too fast for Jasmine to follow, and the 2 figures lunged at him. The man in the black coat shouted something and moved toward the door. But Jasmine didn't see what happened next, because in the confusion, another figure, quiet and unseen until now, slipped through the bedroom window behind her. A hand clamped over her mouth, and as she struggled to scream, the last thing she saw was Malik's wide, terrified eyes staring up at her before the room went black. Asterisk, when Jasmine opened her eyes, everything was dark. Not just the kind of darkness that comes when the lights go out. This was deeper, heavier, like a weight pressing down on her. She tried to move but found her arms pinned behind her, wrists bound with something coarse and biting. She could feel the floor beneath her, cold concrete, damp and gritty, and somewhere far off, the faint echo of water dripping into a puddle. At first, she thought she was alone. But then a voice, low and unfamiliar, came from the shadows. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," it said. Jasmine froze, her breath catching painfully in her chest. Her first thought was Malik. Where was he? Was he safe? She tried to call out, but her throat was dry, and her voice cracked before she could form his name. She strained to listen, hoping desperately for some sign of him, but all she heard was the sound of footsteps circling slowly around her. The voice came again, closer now. "You have something we want," it said. "And whether you know it or you've had it for years." She swallowed hard, her mind racing. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered hoarsely. A bitter laugh echoed back at her. "You all say that," the voice replied, "until you remember." She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to cry. But even as she tried to stay calm, she couldn't stop her thoughts from spinning wildly back to Malik. The last thing she remembered was his wide, frightened eyes staring at her as the hand closed over her mouth and everything went black. Where was he? Now, was he here? Or worse? Just then, a door creaked open somewhere behind her, and light spilled into the room, dim and yellow, but enough to make her squint. Two men entered, both dressed in black from head to toe, their faces hidden behind masks. They moved with quiet efficiency, pulling her roughly to her feet and marching her down a narrow hallway. The building smelled of dust and mildew, the walls lined with pipes that hissed faintly as they passed. She stumbled more than once, her knees weak, but they didn't slow down or loosen their grip on her arms. Finally, they shoved her into another room, this one larger, with a single chair bolted to the floor in the center. She hesitated, and one of the men shoved her forward until she collapsed into the chair. The room fell silent for a long moment. Then another door opened, and a figure stepped inside. It wasn't the man in the black coat this time. It wasn't even her husband. It was someone she had never seen before. An older man, thin but sharp-eyed, his suit crisp and immaculate despite the damp air of the place. He walked with a deliberate calm, his hands clasped lightly behind his back, and when he stopped in front of her, he regarded her as though she were nothing more than an inconvenient puzzle to be solved. "Jasmine," he said, his voice smooth but without warmth. "Do you know who I am?" She shook her head slowly, though her mouth felt too dry to speak. "No," he said thoughtfully, as though answering his own question. "I suppose you wouldn't, and yet you've been carrying my property for nearly 7 years. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "What property?" she whispered. He tilted his head, studying her for a long moment before replying. "Your son," he said softly. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She sat frozen, her breath shallow, unable to process what he just said. "You're lying?" she managed to choke out. But the man simply smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Am I?" He circled around her slowly, his footsteps quiet on the concrete floor. "7 years ago, your husband came to us," he continued. "He was desperate. He owed more than he could ever hope to repay, but he promised us something valuable, something no one else could give. He said he could deliver it to us in exchange for his freedom, and so he did." Jasmine's whole body trembled as she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "You're wrong. Malik is mine. He's my son. He's not yours." The man stopped directly behind her and leaned down until his mouth was level with her ear. "Are you sure?" he murmured. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind screaming against his words. She thought back to the night Malik was born, how her husband had disappeared for hours during her labor, returning only after the baby was already in her arms. She remembered the strange looks from the nurse when she asked about the paperwork, the way her husband had insisted on handling it all himself. No, she couldn't believe it. She wouldn't believe it. Asterisk. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice breaking now. "Where's my son?" The man straightened and stepped back, his faint smile never faltering. "Safe," he said simply. "For now." She lifted her head, her eyes blazing despite the tears streaking her cheeks. "If you hurt him, you'll do what?" The man interrupted softly. "You have no power here, Jasmine. None. But you can still make a choice. Cooperate with us, and the boy remains unharmed. Refuse, and we both know how that ends." Her hands clenched into fists behind her back, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to fight, to rip his smug expression off his face. But more than anything, she wanted to see Malik again, to hold him, to make sure he was safe. Just then, the door opened again, and one of the masked men entered, whispering something into the older man's ear. Whatever it was, his faint smile faded at last, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "It seems," he said slowly, turning back to Jasmine, "that your friend Mr. Pichai is proving more troublesome than expected." Her heart leapt at the mention of Sundar's name, a tiny spark of hope flaring in the darkness. "Where is he?" she demanded, but the man didn't answer. He simply motioned for one of the guards, who stepped forward and slipped a black hood over her head before she could react. Everything went dark again, and she felt herself being dragged to her feet and led down another corridor. After what felt like forever, they stopped, and she was shoved roughly into another room. The hood was ripped away, and she blinked against. The sudden light, what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Sundar was there, bruised but alive, sitting in a chair opposite her, his hands tied behind him. His jacket was gone, his shirt torn and streaked with blood. But when he lifted his head and their eyes met, he managed a faint, reassuring smile. "You're okay," he murmured, his voice hoarse but steady. She shook her head, tears spilling over her cheeks. "No," she whispered. "I'm not. They have Malik." They said, "I know," Sundar interrupted gently. "I know, and we're going to get him back." The older man entered the room, then, his expression darker now, his patience clearly. Thinning, he stood between them, his hands clasped loosely. "Enough games," he said coldly. "You have what we want, both of you, and now you're going to give it to us." Jasmine's brow furrowed through her tears. "What is it?" she demanded. "What do you want?" But the man only looked at Sundar, then, his gaze sharp, and Sundar, still breathing heavily, still tied to the chair, finally spoke, his voice quiet, but full of something Jasmine couldn't quite name. "They're not after you," he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. "They're after me." Jasmine stared at him, confusion and fear twisting inside her. "What?" she whispered. Sundar lowered his head slightly, closing his eyes as though bracing himself. "The deal your husband made," he said. "He didn't just sell them a child. He sold them access. To me, through you." Jasmine's stomach dropped as the pieces began to click into place. The strange letters. The man in the black coat, the photo of her and Malik, the sudden attention after all these years. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sundar opened his eyes then. And what she saw in them startled her, not fear, not even anger, but resolve. "Because," he said quietly, "I built something they want. Something so powerful it can rewrite everything. They know and they need a way in." The older man chuckled faintly at that, shaking his head. "So dramatic," he murmured. But Sundar ignored him, his gaze still locked on Jasmine. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent now. "Whatever happens next, you protect Malik. No matter what, do you hear me?" She nodded numbly, though. Her hands were shaking. Just then, the older man gave a sharp nod, and one of the guards moved forward, pulling Sundar roughly to his feet. He winced but stayed upright, his eyes still fixed on hers. "Take him," the older man ordered. "We'll deal with the girl later." As they dragged Sundar out of the room, Jasmine rose to her feet, straining against her bonds, her voice breaking as she cried out after him, "What are you going to do?" He turned his head just enough to look back at her, and despite everything, he smiled faintly. "Whatever it takes," he said. And then he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Jasmine alone in the cold, silent room, her chest heaving, her mind racing, and somewhere, faint but unmistakable, she thought she heard Malik's voice calling for her, asterisk for what felt like hours. Jasmine sat alone in that silent room, her hands still bound, her body aching from the cold and the fear that gripped her chest like a vice. She stared at the door, half hoping and half dreading it would open again. Every sound beyond the walls, every faint footstep, every muffled voice sent her heart hammering faster. She couldn't tell if it was day or night anymore. Time felt meaningless here, swallowed up by the darkness and the dread that hung in the air like fog. But the worst part wasn't the pain or the cold or even the waiting. It was not knowing where Malik was, not knowing what they were doing to Sundar, not knowing if either of them would survive whatever was coming. She closed her eyes and thought of Malik's tiny hands holding hers, of the way he used to fall asleep curled up against her side when he was scared. She thought of Sundar's steady eyes, his quiet strength, the way he'd said whatever it takes before they dragged him away. Those 3 words echoed in her mind now, over and over, as though clinging to them could keep her sane. And then, at last, the door opened. But it wasn't the older man this time. And it wasn't the guard's. It was Sundar. He stood in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, his shirt torn and bloodied, his breathing ragged. But his eyes, dark and burning with something she hadn't seen before, met hers, and For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a faint flicker of hope. "Can you walk?" he asked hoarsely. She nodded quickly, already on her feet despite the way her knees shook beneath her. Sundar stepped inside, his fingers fumbling at the ropes around her wrists. When they finally fell away, she almost sobbed in relief, rubbing at the raw skin. "Malik," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Where is he?" Sundar's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he nodded toward the door. "He's alive," he said softly. "But we don't have much time." He didn't wait for her reply. He just took her hand firmly and pulled her out into the corridor. The hall was eerily quiet now, though she could see signs of struggle, dark stains on the floor, splintered wood, the faint smell of smoke in the air. Sundar moved quickly, but carefully, his steps silent despite his obvious pain. Every so often he would pause, listening, his grip on her tightening before he continued. They climbed a narrow staircase that seemed to go on forever, finally emerging into a long hallway, lined with heavy metal doors. Sundar stopped in front of one and pressed his ear to it. Then he nodded, as though deciding something, and slipped a thin black card from his pocket, sliding it into the electronic lock. With a soft click, the door swung open, and there, in the middle of the room, was Malik. He sat on a cot, his little legs swinging, his cheeks streaked with tears, but his eyes still bright and searching. The moment he saw her, he cried out, and Jasmine rushed forward, gathering him into her arms so tightly it hurt. "Mama," he whispered against her neck, his tiny hands clutching her shirt. "I was so scared." "I know, baby," she murmured, pressing her lips to his hair. "I know, but it's okay now. I've got you." Sundar stood by the door, his eyes scanning the room, his body tense. "We have to move," he said quietly. "Now." She nodded, cradling Malik against her chest as they followed Sundar back into the hallway. But as they reached the stairwell, a voice rang out behind them. "You can't leave." They all froze. The older man stood at the end of the hall, flanked by two guards. His immaculate suit was slightly rumpled now, but his expression was as calm and cold as ever. "You think this ends here?" he asked softly, his hands clasped behind his back. "You think you can just walk away from us?" Sundar stepped in front of Jasmine and Malik, his shoulders squared despite the blood still dripping from a cut above his eye. "It ends when I say it does," Sundar replied evenly. The older man actually smiled at that, a thin, humorless smile. "Do you really believe you're strong enough to stop us?" But Sundar didn't flinch. "Not strong enough," he said quietly. "Just stubborn enough." And with that, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black device, no larger than a deck of cards. It blinked faintly in his hand, casting a pale blue light on his bruised fingers. The older man's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his perfect composure. "You wouldn't," he said. Asterisk, but Sundar just smiled faintly. "You never understood me," he said softly. "You thought I was building it for you, but I wasn't." He pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, all at once, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. The air filled with a strange, high-pitched hum, and Jasmine felt her hair stand on end as though the very walls around them were alive. The guards staggered back, clutching their earpieces, their weapons falling from their hands. Sundar grabbed Jasmine's arm and pulled her toward the stairwell. "Run," he said. They ran, got down flight after flight of stairs, through darkened hallways and out into the night. The rain had stopped, and the air was cool and clean against Jasmine's skin. As they stumbled into the street, Sundar flagged down a waiting car, the same black sedan from earlier, and ushered them inside. The driver didn't speak, just pulled away from the curb and melted into the quiet streets of Atlanta. Jasmine held Malik close, her hand still, trembling, her heart still hammering in her chest. She glanced at Sundar, who sat opposite them, his head resting against the window, his eyes half closed but still alert. She whispered finally. Asterisk, he opened his eyes and looked at her,